Hello, everybody. Hope you're all doing well. This is Janet Gannon, and this is our second lecture about marine ecology. If you haven't watched Marine Ecology 1A and 1B, then go back and watch those before you proceed into this lecture. In our last lecture, we talked about what ecology is. So ecology is the study of how abiotic parts of the environment affect biotic parts of the environment, or how biotic parts of the environment can affect abiotic parts of the environment. We talked about the idea that we have ecosystems that include both living and non-living elements of the environment, all right? And we started to talk about how non-living components, including physical and chemical characteristics, can affect living organisms. We got done with talking about temperature. So we talked about how temperature can affect plankton and how certain plankton will bloom when the temperature is the proper within the proper parameters for them. We talked about the rocky intertidal and about how different organisms, different types of barnacles are either adapted to tolerate high temperatures or are adapted to be better competitors so they can live in the preferred environment. And we also talked about how ecosystems, you can have this idea of a trophic cascade where you have when an abiotic part of the environment, such as temperature, affects one part of the environment, including green crabs here, how that can then affect another living part of the environment. So when temperatures are low, green crab populations are low, and because green crabs are not preying on clams, there's a lot of clams around. We have this peak here, and so clam harvests are high. All right, so we finished talking about temperature, and today we're going to move on into salinity and hydrostatic pressure, and then we're going to talk about some of the other elements of marine ecology. So salinity. Salinity is, we've talked a lot about salinity in ocean water and how it is one of the important elements of ocean water. And one of the really obvious ways that that salinity might affect marine organisms is just in their shell construction. So here we have some blue mussels and we have some barnacles on these. So all of these organisms grew their shell from the salts, from the ions that live in, or that are found in salt water, right? We have calcium carbonate very commonly being used, and those are things that clams, for example, pull calcium carbonate out of the water and they build their shells with them. But then we also have things like silicone. So silica is used by diatoms. We're going to talk a lot about diatoms a little bit later in this lecture. So these salts are used for marine organisms. If we have a change in salinity, that means that shells can either be harder to grow or easier to grow. So those are that's just a really simple way to think about salinity and how it might affect marine organisms. Salinity doesn't just affect shellfish, though. It affects every organism in the ocean. So let's talk about some of just the basics of how water and salt interact and behave. So the first thing I want to talk about is diffusion. All right. So if you have something that is put into water, all right, such as salt, it will move from high concentration to low concentration. All right. Salt, if you have a solution like this where you put salt just in one side, if you wait long enough, that salt will spread so it is evenly spread through the entire solution. All right. So that's one of the things that consistently happens with salt concentrations. Now, that's diffusion. If you talk about osmosis, you've probably heard of the phrase osmosis. So osmosis is the idea that things move from low concentration to high concentration. Water moves from low concentration to high concentration, and particularly in osmosis, it needs to be over some sort of semi-permeable membrane. Now, your cells are semi-permeable membranes, all right? Things can move into them or things can move out of them. And that makes sense. Your cells need water to do their job, so water needs to move from the environment into them. And then they also produce waste, so waste needs to move out of cells into the bloodstream, and then you clean it out with your kidneys, and that becomes urine. All right, so osmosis happens all the time in your body. And one of the things that happens in osmosis is that if you have on one side of this semipermeable membrane, if you have a solution with less salt, and then on the other side a solution with more salt, water will move from the low concentration to the high concentration until that concentration is equal on both sides. All right. Now, if you've ever brined a piece of meat, this is why you do this. You put salt on the outside so that you have liquid come out of that piece of meat. Or if you've ever done something like salted eggplant before you cook it, you're doing that to get some of the liquid out of the eggplant, so it's not quite so, I don't know, it's firmer. All right, so if you've ever done that, then you have taken advantage of osmosis. Now, fish in water, they have osmosis occurring all the time. So the chemistry of body fluids for marine organisms, it's salty. It's similar to the salt level in seawater, but it's not identical. So osmosis has to happen all the time for these guys. So let's see how this looks. All right. Marine animals want to osmoregulate. Okay, that means they want to regulate the osmosis that occurs in their bodies. They don't want water to just move out of them into seawater, so they become dehydrated. Or if you're a freshwater fish, you have more salt than the surrounding water. You don't want water to just move into your body and not be regulated. All right, so freshwater fish and saltwater fish approach this differently. So if you're a freshwater fish, then your bodily fluids are saltier than the water around you. That means that water wants to move from the water around you into your body. All right. So they want to prevent this. So one of the things they do is they don't drink water. Okay. Their cells absorb salt. They have mechanisms to really hold on to salt. All right. And then when these freshwater fish have too much water in them, they produce a lot of urine. So these guys pee a lot. If you're a freshwater fish, you pee a lot. All right. The kidneys pull water out of your body and get it out of there. Just the opposite happens if you're a saltwater fish. So if you're a saltwater fish, your bodily fluids are less salty than the water around you. So the water wants to leave you, okay? It wants to come out of your body and go into your surroundings. You don't want that to happen because then you'll become dehydrated. So these guys actually drink seawater. I know that sounds strange because it's full of salt, but they excrete that salt. They pull it out and they excrete it using their gills. So they can actually take seawater in, they can pull fresh water from the seawater, and they can get rid of the salt using their gills. One of the things that they do is they don't urinate very much, right? They hold on to urine because that urine is fresh, all right, compared to their surroundings. So these guys are osmoregulating, and that's one of the adaptations that that fish have and other organisms have as well to surviving in a salty environment. Now, there are some organisms that produce this in that cope with this in a different way. And a great example of that would be barnacles. So barnacles, they are stuck in one place, right? They're glued down. And they're in a place where sometimes things are really salty and sometimes things are really fresh because they're near the land. So if there's a lot of rain, they have a lot of fresh water around them, right? So they might experience a lot of differences in how much salt is in the water. When this happens, well, one of the things they do is they just close up their shells and it's like closing the door, and they wait until conditions get a little bit better, and then they open their door again and they feed. Right? So that's another mechanism that you could use to deal with salinity. Now let's move on to hydrostatic pressure, and I really can't resist playing this while I'm doing this.
Pressure pushing down on me, pressing down on you, no man has fall.
Okay, I won't subject you to all of that, but every time I think about the word under pressure, I think of that song. All right, so we live under pressure. Even animals that live on land are under pressure all the time because we have an atmosphere of air above us. So air is something. It has mass. It's being pulled down towards the earth, right, by gravity. And that means that we have a whole bunch on top of things on top of us. The whole atmosphere, if we're down here at sea level, the whole atmosphere of air is above us and it's being pulled down onto us. And that means that we have pressure from that around us all the time. So we have what's called one atmosphere or one bar of pressure on every inch of us, on every square inch of us. We have 14.7 pounds of air pressing on that 1 square inch, all right? So that changes, that's at sea level, but that will actually change as you go up into the atmosphere, either up in the mountains or in a plane or something like that. We have less atmospheric pressure. If you've ever gone up into the mountains, driven up into the mountains and your ears pop, that's happening because atmospheric pressure is different. And so you get the air in your ears has it's been put in there at 1 atmosphere of pressure if you're here in Brunswick at sea level. And then as you go up, the pressure around your ears is reduced. So you have different pressures inside and outside of your ears. And so your ears pop to let some of that pressure out from your ears so it equalizes. That's what happens there. So we're under pressure all the time, even here on land. However, water is much, much denser than air, all right? So the same thing happens due to the weight of the water column, just like it happens due to the weight of the atmosphere. But because water is so much denser, it happens under much, much smaller amounts of distance. So if you are at sea level and you go down you go down 10 meters, that's the equivalent of 1 atmosphere or 1 bar. Okay, so this just going down 10 meters is the same pressure that we have from the entire atmosphere over us. All right, so pressure increases very, very strongly in the ocean. And you can imagine if you're very, very deep in the ocean, then you have a huge amount of pressure pushing in on you. All right, so you need to be adapted to that. So one of the ways that animals adapt to that, deep sea animals adapt to that, they don't have gases in their body. If you're a fish that swims up near the surface, then you have something called a swim bladder, and that swim bladder is a hollow organism that's filled with gas, and that is one of the ways that you can stay neutrally buoyant. But deep sea animals don't have that because those gases would be crushed by the pressure of all that water. So that's one of the ways that they adapt to being in the deep sea. There are a lot of other ways that organisms adapt to going down deep. So there are a lot of organisms that live mostly on the surface, but they dive very, very deep to get their prey. And a great example of that would be a sperm whale. There are also a bunch of seals that dive very, very deep. And these organisms have adaptations so they can do that. And one of those adaptations is their lungs. Their lungs can actually collapse completely as they dive deep. And all of that air that's in their lungs, it gets pushed into their bloodstream. Okay, so our lungs can't do that. If we go too deep, our lungs can't survive that. But deep divers are designed to do that. Now, we're going to go ahead and take a moment and think about something called the bends. If you might have heard about the bends, especially if you're interested in scuba diving, the bends are an important thing that you need to think about. So we're just going to take a moment and watch this video about the bends.
Drawing out the facts, the Naked Science Scrapbook. Hello and welcome to the Naked Science Scrapbook from the Naked Scientist. This time we're answering the question, why don't whales get the bends when Drawing out the facts, the Naked Science Scrapbook. Hello and welcome to the Naked Science Scrapbook from the Naked Scientist. This time we're answering the question, why don't whales get the bends when divers can? If scuba divers surface too quickly, they can get the bends. But what is the bends? And why don't whales that can dive over 2 kilometres down get it when they come back up to the surface? First of all, what is the bends? The proper medical term is decompression sickness, and it happens when gases dissolved in a diver's blood and tissues come out of solution and turn into bubbles of gas inside the blood vessels and tissues. This blocks the flow of blood along the blood vessels, starving the cells of oxygen and nutrients. In severe cases, the tissues can die. The bubbles can form anywhere, so any organ can be affected. In the skeleton, it causes excruciating bone and joint pains, which is actually where the name the bends comes from. In the skin, a rash can develop, and when the nervous system is affected, loss of balance, confusion, and in the most serious cases, paralysis, unconsciousness, and even death can occur. The bends can be brought on by rapid ascent from depth underwater, by leaving a high-pressure environment like a pressurized airplane cabin, or by ascending to high altitude in a non-pressurized aircraft. And in fact, you shouldn't fly if you've been scuba diving the day before. So to look at what's actually going on, let's meet Jeff, a scuba diver. When Jeff dives, he takes a tank of pressurized air with him to breathe. As he descends, the pressure of the water above him on his body increases by 1 atmosphere for every 10 meters he goes down, on top of the 1 atmosphere of pressure already present at the surface. So 10 meters down, there's double the normal pressure on his body. The regulator in his mouth is specially designed to compensate for the higher pressure of the surrounding water. So even as he goes deeper and the water pressure goes up around him, he can still breathe normally. But when Jeff breathes in, because he's breathing air at a higher pressure than normal from his tank and regulator, and because the surrounding water is putting extra pressure on his body, the gas he's breathing is much more dense than it would be at the surface, so more of the gas than normal will dissolve out of the lungs into the blood and tissues. Air is made up of around 78% nitrogen, and at normal atmospheric pressure this isn't very soluble, so it only dissolves into the blood in very small amounts. But at high pressure, gases become more soluble. This is called Henry's law. So more nitrogen will dissolve into the blood when Jeff is breathing the pressurized air underwater. Normally, when we breathe, gases like oxygen easily pass into our blood and are transported to the body's tissues, and waste substances like carbon dioxide produced by our tissues are carried in the blood back to the lungs, where they diffuse back into the air in the lungs and are breathed out. But if Jeff comes to the surface too quickly, the pressure in his lungs and on his body will decrease too quickly for the lungs to get rid of the gases coming out of solution, particularly the nitrogen, as this becomes much less soluble as the pressure decreases. It's a bit like popping the top of a can of fizzy drink. You suddenly decrease the pressure around the fluid, and lots of the dissolved CO2 comes out of solution as bubbles, frothing up and escaping into the air. Except in the case of Jeff, the bubbles are forming inside his blood, his bones, and his organs. To treat the bends if a diver has surfaced too quickly, doctors use a decompression chamber. The sufferer is put inside and the air pressure is increased until it closely matches the pressures the diver was experiencing when he was underwater. This forces the bubbles of nitrogen back into solution in the blood. The pressure is then slowly decreased back to atmospheric pressure again, allowing the lungs to get rid of the nitrogen safely. So what about whales? Some species will dive over 2 kilometres down, where the pressure can be up to 300 times that at the surface of the ocean. So why don't they get decompression sickness when they come back up to the surface to take a breath? Well, it varies depending on the species of whale and how deep they dive. Mid-depth diving whales, like many of the baleen whales, take a deep breath at the surface and carry it down with them when they dive. And this is the first key point. They are taking lungfuls of normal atmospheric pressure air at the surface, not breathing the pressurized air found in scuba tanks. This means that the amount of nitrogen that can dissolve in the blood as the whales dive is much lower, relatively speaking, than the amount that dissolves in a diver. Also, as the whale dives, the huge pressure on its body compresses the lungs, forcing the air back into the trachea and nasal passages, where less gas can dissolve into the blood, further reducing the likelihood of nitrogen dissolving. The deepest diving whales, like sperm whales, take more drastic measures. After taking several deep breaths at the surface to charge up their extra efficient oxygen-carrying blood and muscles, they actually breathe out before diving. As they descend, their lungs collapse completely and very little nitrogen enters their blood, so they can safely dive deep and resurface several times every day. As an added precaution, when the whales that do take a breath down with them resurface, they do so very slowly, stopping off on their journey back up several times. And human divers are actually trained to use the same strategy to stop themselves getting the bends. But despite their best efforts, there is evidence that whales do nonetheless develop decompression sickness. Whale bones have been found that bear the telltale osteonecrotic signs of damage done by the bends. Why is this? Well, one theory is that human use of sonar can startle whales and disrupt their behaviour, making them surface much more rapidly than they would normally, causing them to develop the bends. And some species of deep-diving beaked whales have been found to have very high levels of nitrogen in their tissues that they can only tolerate by controlling carefully the rate at which they surface. So the answer really is that usually whales don't get the bends, but if they get disturbed or startled, most often by human activity, then sadly they still can. That's it for this time. To get the answers to more science questions, join us online at thenakedscientist.com/scrapbook. Bye!
Okay, we've talked about some of the pressures from the abiotic part of ecosystems on biotic parts, but let's talk about how the living parts of ecosystems survive some of these challenges. So when we talk about how organisms are designed, how they have evolved to handle different pressure, we're talking about adaptations. And you can imagine that living in a place that has so many challenges, here's one of them, just being in a really, really turbulent place, that you'd need to be specially adapted for that. So we're going to talk about that for the remainder of this lecture. And we're going to talk about it in all of the lifestyles. We're going to talk about it for some plankton, we're going to talk about it for some nekton, and we're going to talk about it for some benthic organisms. All right, so in the plankton, we're going to talk about adaptations to stay afloat. In the nekton, we're going to talk about adaptations to swim efficiently. And in the benthic organisms, we're going to talk about how organisms are adapted to take advantage of zonation. All right. So when we talk about plankton, we're going to start by just talking about phytoplankton. And we're going to compare these guys to start with to land plants. So if you think about land plants versus ocean plants, both of these organisms are photosynthesizers. So they take energy from the sun. They use carbon dioxide and they use water, and they use solar energy to photosynthesize. All right, so they take these two substances, and the result is that they have sugar, this is glucose, and they have oxygen that they make. All right, so the entire basis of the food chain in the entire world is based on this. All right, with some exceptions, actually. There's some chemosynthesis in really, really extreme habitats, but for most of the world, for 99.999% of the world, photosynthesis is the basis for all living things. All right, you either photosynthesize, or you eat something that photosynthesizes, or you eat something that eats something that photosynthesizes. All right. One important thing to realize is that land plants evolved from the plankton, from phytoplankton. So they have common metabolic pathways and they have common things that they need to do, but they have different challenges because they live in different habitats. And if you think about like a land plant, one of the big challenges for a land plant is getting water. All right, so that's why they have roots. They put their roots down into the soil, and they draw water up from the soil, and they use that. Now, of course, if you were a phytoplankton, you're surrounded by water, so that's not a challenge. So ocean plants and land plants have different challenges, and we're going to focus on some of the challenges for ocean plants. And the big challenge for them is that they need to be in the sun, and the sun only reaches the top part of the ocean, right? So about the top 200 meters, if you're out in the open ocean and away from coastal influences, for example, here in Georgia, we have so much sediment in our water being pulled down from the inside of the state that certainly this isn't true here. Our sunlight only reaches definitely not 200 meters, much less than that here. But imagine you're out in the open ocean. Water out there, the sunlight can reach about 200 meters down into it, bright enough that you can have some photosynthesizing occurring. If you're up at the top, it's really, really bright. If you're down here, it's less bright. But up here, you have enough for photosynthesis in general. When you get below that, we get into sort of a twilight area. Here, we don't have enough photosynthesis that could occur for an organism to survive, and especially down here in the deep, deep part of the ocean, it's very, very dark. So if you're a plankton, if you're a phytoplankton, you need to stay up here to get enough sunlight to photosynthesize. If you fall below this, then you are going to starve to death. All right, so the big thing for phytoplankton is you want to find a way to stay up at the surface. That's what you're adapting to do. So one of the ways that you do this is you stay small, and that increases your surface area to volume ratio. So surface area is just basically how big is your outside. All right, if you have a large surface area to volume ratio, that means that surface area is how water, that's how friction occurs. So one of the ways you stay up is you just have water holding you up. All right, you want to have a lot of friction compared to having a low amount of friction, because that will keep you afloat. All right, because you don't want to fall, so you want water to hold you up. So you want to have a high surface area to volume ratio. So let's look at this diagram over here. We have something that's kind of small and something that's kind of large, and we can look at the surface area versus the volume for each one of these. So if I have this cube has 6 sides, right? And imagine that I have 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter, right? So if that's the case, then my surface area, each one of these is 1 centimeter squared. And I can, if I have 6 sides, that's 6 centimeters squared, all right? So my surface area is 6, whereas my volume is length times width, right? Times height, all right? So 3 dimensions. So here I have 1 times 1 times 1, all right? Times 1, all right? So my volume, if I do 1 times 1 times 1, my volume is 1. So if I am really small, my surface area to volume ratio is 6. But as I get bigger, my surface area and my volume change so that my surface area to volume ratio gets smaller. Look, this is 3 and this is 2, and if I continue to get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. So you want to stay small, all right? Because you stay small, it means you have a lot of surface area compared to what's inside of you. And that surface area, that's what provides the friction that keeps you afloat. Something else you want to do is you want to have low density. So phytoplankton tend to have a lot of lipids in them, a lot of fats in them, all right? So if you've ever poured oil onto water, you know that oil floats on top of water. That's because it's less dense. And so if you have oil inside of your body, you will float on top of water. Now, if you're like a swimmer, you tend to have not a lot of fats on you, so you sink. If you've ever been swimming with someone who's really, really muscular, they will sink to the bottom. Whereas they might have a friend who maybe has eaten too many brownies, and that person will float on the surface a little bit more easily, right? This is true for phytoplanktons as well, all right? So they want to have a lot of lipids so they can stay afloat. Also, you want to have a lot of spines and pores because this provides increased surface area and increased friction against the water, and that will keep you afloat. So let's look at what some of our phytoplanktons look like. So we have diatoms on the left side, and we have dinoflagellates on the right side. And you can see these guys have a lot of pores. Those increase your surface area. They also allow water and other substances to go in and out of your body. So that's good because you need to be exchanging water and getting rid of your waste and pulling in nutrients and things like that. So they have a lot of pores. That's one of the things that's really, really typical of diatoms. And these guys over here, one of the things that's typical of dinoflagellates is they have these great big spikes. And both of these strategies increase your surface area, and that helps you stay afloat. Now, what if you're not plankton? What if you're an ocean plant that doesn't just float around? What if you're a benthic ocean plant, such as seaweed? Now, if you're seaweed, you want to stay rooted to the bottom because if you float off from the bottom, then you can sink all the way down to the deep parts of the ocean and you will not be able to photosynthesize. So seaweeds tend to have something called a holdfast. So they don't have roots that dig down into the bottom. Instead, they have something called a holdfast. This is the bottom of a piece of seaweed here. This is a laminaria. And this holdfast, it looks a lot like a root system, doesn't it? But instead of going down into the rock, this is on a rock, it has all these little sticky feet, basically, and it sticks down really, really hard, okay? These are very, very sticky. So that's another way that you can prevent yourself from falling to the very bottom of the ocean, so you stay where you want to stay and you can photosynthesize. Now let's talk a little bit more about diatoms. Diatoms are incredibly important in the ocean. They're massively, massively abundant. One of the most abundant organisms in the ocean. They have a silica shell, all right, and they produce a huge amount of the oxygen for our planet. 20 to 50% of all the oxygen that you breathe is produced by diatoms. So they're really important to our atmosphere, to all of the organisms on Earth. They're typically found in temperate waters, so places like New England or Europe and Norway or Japan. They're very, very typical. They're in Antarctica, in fact, and they're the basis of the food chain. So you can have, because there's so many of them and they're the basis of the food chain, you can have really, really abundant food chains, a lot of biomass in places where you have a lot of diatoms. So if you think about the great fisheries of the world, like New England has a great fishery, Japan does. Europe does. And that's because there are so many diatoms that they produce a lot of fish, and those fish can be harvested by us. So these guys are really quite interesting. We've looked at some of the pictures of them. They have a hard shell, and it's called a frustule, okay? And it kind of looks like a little pillbox, right? They have a top to it that's a little bit larger than this, and it's sort of like these are two, it's like a box almost, where this part fits over this part, all right? Inside of that, they have their nucleus where they have their DNA. They have cytoplasm. They have things like oil-filled vacuoles. So remember we said that they like to have a lot of lipids so they can stay afloat. So they keep those lipids in little containers called vacuoles. And then they have this hard shell made of silica, and they have little perforations. This is where things like water come in and out, nutrients come in and out. They get rid of their waste through here, okay? Now these guys, when they divide, when they reproduce, they either reproduce asexually or sexually. So if you're reproducing asexually, it means you're just dividing. You're just dividing yourself in half, and that's not uncommon for single-celled organisms, all right? So this is what they do most of the time. Most of the time, they reproduce asexually. And what that looks like is this guy right here, when he divides, he splits himself in two. He literally just takes half of his stuff here, this nucleus splits into it, copies the DNA, and it makes two nuclei. It splits half of the vacuoles, half of the cytoplasm. So half of it go one way, half of it go other way, and each new copy of the cell gets one of those new nuclei. All right, so this guy here, he's going to reproduce, and he's going to make one copy of himself that is the same size that he originally was, and one that is smaller. And that's because when he divides, one half gets this bigger part of the shell, and one half gets the smaller part of the shell. The half that gets the bigger part of the shell, well, it grows one of these smaller guys, right? So he stays the same size. But if you get this half, if you're the new cell that gets this half, You can't grow something bigger. You can only grow something smaller. So you grow something that's a little bit smaller. All right. So this guy grows one copy that's the same size and one copy that's a little bit smaller. Now, when this guy divides, he makes one copy that's the same size and one copy that's a little bit smaller. And then when this guy divides, he makes one copy that's the same size and one copy that's just a little bit smaller. So you're going from something large, and it's making some copies that are the same size, but then it's making some copies that are a little bit smaller, and then it's making some copies that are even a little bit smaller, and eventually we get some that are just too small to fit all of this stuff in, all right, where you can't fit in the nucleus and the vacuoles and the cytoplasm and all the things that you need for a cell to work. And when that happens, um, this cell ditches the hard shell. It ditches the frustule. Here he is right here. And he's called a naked cell. And he goes around and looks for another cell, and they together will sexually reproduce, and they will produce great big babies like this. And then we'll go back into the asexual reproduction portion of this. All right. So one of the advantages of dividing asexually is that you can do it really, really fast. And that means you can take advantage of times when things are really good. So you can have a phytoplankton bloom. You can actually have, you can make a new generation of babies in 12 to 24 hours. So you can double your population every 12 to 24 hours. So your population can grow very, very fast. If conditions are good, you want to do that and take advantage of it. So this is a phytoplankton bloom this is in the Bering Sea. So this is Alaska here. These are the Aleutian Islands. This is the mainland of Alaska. And conditions are perfect in the Bering Sea. And so we have this phytoplankton bloom that's occurring. All right. So that's these are some of the really important parts of the bottom of the food chain. But let's look at plankters that are a little bit higher in the food chain. So one of the organisms that loves to eat diatoms would be copepods. So copepods are hugely abundant in temperate waters. This is what they look like. They're zooplankton, all right? They swim freely and they will feed on diatoms, and they do it in a variety of ways. One of the ways that they do it is through filter feeding. They can actually create a current and they can filter feed. They also can swim really fast and just capture things. There's lots of ways to do it. Let's take a look at just one of the ways they do it by creating a feeding current. So you can see this guy is creating a current, and he is filtering diatoms out of that current that he can then eat. Okay, we'll stop at that. There's lots of other ways that they feed, but I want to talk about copepods because they're sort of the next level up in the food chain. And let's just take a little detour out of the plankton and let's talk about the next step in the food chain for copepods. Lots and lots of things eat copepods. Lots of things love to eat copepods. And one of the things that is reliant on copepods are right whales. So right whales are the Georgia state marine mammal. The females come here to have their babies in winter. But most of the time, they live up north where there are a lot of diatoms, and that means there's a lot of copepods, and that means there's a lot of things for them to eat. So right whales feed on huge, huge numbers of copepods. So copepods often get concentrated because of different amounts of salt and different temperatures of water into these large aggregation, and that's what right whales are looking to feed on, is aggregations of copepods. They feed using filter feeding. So here we have a right whale here. And when they filter feed, water goes in the mouth right here and gets pushed out through their baleen. All right. So it goes in the mouth, out through the baleen. And that baleen is sort of like a comb. And when the water is forced through it, the copepods stay inside. All right, so they're combing copepods out of the water through filter feeding. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Here we have a right whale that's skim feeding. It's just swimming through the water with its mouth open. Water is going in the mouth and being forced out through the baleen, and the copepods are being filtered from that water. Now that might sound kind of gross, but copepods are closely related to shrimp, so probably tastes pretty good. All right. Now let's move on to some of the adaptations in the nekton. Remember, nekton are free-swimming organisms. Now, one of the things to think about is that if you're a swimmer, air is pretty easy to move through, but water is not. If you've ever been in the water and tried to walk through the water, you know it's a lot harder to walk through water than it is through air. If you are a swimmer and you want to swim efficiently, you want to reduce drag. Okay, drag is sort of like it's friction from whatever you're moving through. All right, so there are 3 types of drag that you want to reduce. You want to reduce surface drag, and that's just the more surface area you have, the more friction occurs over it. All right, so you want to reduce that if you are trying to swim efficiently. So you reduce your surface area compared to your volume. You also want to reduce form drag. Right? Think about if you were walking through the water straight, that can be hard, but one of the ways that makes it easier is you can walk through the water sideways. It sort of makes you more hydrodynamic, okay? It's the same idea as aerodynamic, but it's through the water. You also want to reduce turbulence. If you think about how race cars have that rear spoiler, they have that to reduce turbulence, and swimmers have things like that as well. So if you can reduce all 3 of these things, you become a really efficient swimmer and you become a really fast swimmer, so you can swim fast and catch things. Now here's an example of an organism that has reduced drag really, really well. So this is a bluefin tuna. It's a tremendous predator. It's sort of like the greyhound of the sea. And it has reduced drag so well that it swims very, very fast. So it can swim really, really fast and catch things. However, it's not good at other things. Like it's not really maneuverable. It's not good at hiding. It can't camouflage itself. So it's relying on being a fast swimmer as its strategy to catch things and to survive, or to outrun things as well. All right, so that's one way that you can strategize adapting to living in water. However, there's a lot of fish who don't do this. So let's just talk about some of the organisms who don't do this. So this guy here is a sea dragon. He's a type of seahorse, and you can see he has a lot of surface area. Oh, he has a lot of drag on him. So he's a super slow swimmer, but he's really good at camouflaging himself. He lives in this seaweed and he can hide himself really, really efficiently. So he may not swim well, but he has another adaptation that makes up for that. We have another very slow swimmer. This is the lionfish. Terrible swimmer, but he stings. So he catches things by stinging them, and he protects himself by stinging things. All right, so that's his strategy. Here we have, oh, it's Nemo. He's a clownfish. He is also a slow swimmer, but he has a very powerful friend. So he lives in the tentacles of a sea anemone. So these guys are good friends. Nemo this clownfish will clean the sea anemone, and the sea anemone protects the clownfish from predators. So that's his strategy. And then we have this guy here. So these are anglerfish, and he is a very slow swimmer, but he is tricksy and toothy. Look at his teeth here, right? If anything gets near him, he can open his mouth really, really fast, and he actually sucks fish in. And he tricks them because he has this thing right here. And this is his lure. He likes to lure fish in, use this to make other fish think that there's like a little baby plankton that they can eat. So let's watch and see what this looks like.
Do a little, are you trying to get
This right here,
Oh, I don't think so.
that's his lure.
He's so excited. Look at him.
Oh, watch out, fish, watch out! Okay, So let's move on to some of the adaptations that organisms on the benthos have. All right, we've talked a little bit about barnacles in the intertidal. And we talked about how in the intertidal, the higher you are, the hotter and drier it is, and the lower you are, the cooler and wetter it is. So this is the preferred habitat, and this is the not preferred habitat. And we see patterns of zonation that are consistent worldwide. Over and over, we see the same patterns. So we've talked about these two barnacles, Thamylus and Balanus, and how they have adapted to live in different places based on their tolerance of temperature or their ability to outcompete other organisms. So Thamylus up here, he is adapted to tolerate heat and desiccation. Right? So this species can tolerate physiological stress. If, however, if the barnacle larvae settles down here, it's a terrible competitor. And so Balanus will outcompete it. It will actually crush it. All right. Balanus, on the other hand, if he settles up here, if that species settles up here, then it dries out, right? It can't survive in hot, dry places. So both of these organisms are adapted to live in different places in the intertidal, right? So one adaptation is temperature, being temperature tolerant, and one adaptation is to be a great competitor. Now we see zonation in many, many intertidal habitats. So we talked about the rocky intertidal, but let's look at the soft intertidal, like a mud flat or a sand flat. We say the same thing in zonation there. Now, if you're in fauna, we talked about the idea that some organisms live in the bottom; they burrow down, and these are called in fauna. There are challenges to that, right? You have to dig down into the sediment, so you have to dig or burrow. You have to construct some sort of structurally sound burrow. And also think about, like, when you're in the sand, it can rub you, right? You can get blisters from it. Imagine having sand rub against your whole body all the time, right? It's very abrasive. So you have to be very, very well adapted to that. But there are a lot of benefits to being in fauna. So you can protect yourself from predators, you can protect yourself from wave energy, and ooh, it's really nice, like when the environment, when the habitat drains out because of low tide, you are protected from desiccation, because that bottom, inside the bottom, it's very, very cool and moist. All right. So let's look at some of the adaptations for in fauna. Now we've talked about razor clams. Razor clams are really cool because they're really, I don't know, not aerodynamic or hydrodynamic. They're like the same kind of thing. They can dig, they're shaped so they can dig really, really efficiently and pass through sand very, very efficiently. So this is what one of the ways that they look. And here's another one. And this is what they look like when they're actually under the sediment. So they filter feed. Here they're showing you some filter feeding occurring, and here is his muscular foot, and he's dug down, so he's protected there. Let's look at what that muscular foot looks like on another type of clam. This is actually a hard-shell clam. Its Latin name is Mercenaria, and you might think, oh, that's just it, that little foot, it's not impressive. Look at this guy's foot. Okay, so he's not, this says it's licking salt. It's not really licking salt. He's just trying to dig. He's trying to dig down into the sediment. So these guys have a muscular foot that they're adapted so they can dig down into sand. And we also have lots of worms that live in the sediment. And if you've ever seen holes like this, these are made by worms. This type of worm here has two openings. He has like a U-shaped burrow, and he filter feeds. He creates a current. This guy down here creates a current. He sucks water in and shoots it out like this, all right, and that's how he filter feeds. We also have terabellid worms.
Of all the worms that reside in the sea, one of the most fascinating is the terabellid.
My favorite worms are the terabellid annelids, and they live in tubes. And all you ever see is the opening of the tube at the surface of the mud. They're called spaghetti worms because they have these long, thin, white, extendable tentacles that go out over the mud surface. And these tentacles are grooved. They pick up particles in their tentacles, move the particles to the mouth. And there at the mouth, they'll sort those particles according to size. Some will be used to build up their tube. Most of them are used as food for the worm. So all you ever see of this worm, usually, are the white, extendable tentacles that look like spaghetti on the ocean floor. And sometimes you might see a frilly, bright red bush of gills.
All right, I'm going to just point out that that was sped up quite a bit. They don't move quite that fast, but that's one of the ways that these guys are adapted to living in the bottom. And then here's just finally one last organism that is in fauna. You've probably seen these on the beaches here in St. Simon's. All right, so they have all these adaptations, and they're also adapted just like our rocky intertidal organisms, like our barnacles in the rocky intertidal. They're adapted to differences in high tide and low tide. So some organisms can only survive down here where they're wet and cool all the time, and they are the good competitors. But then we have some that can live way up here, and they can tolerate being warmer and drier, but they're terrible competitors, right? So we see this pattern of zonation not only in the rocky intertidal, we see it in sand flats, we see it in mud flats, we see it in salt marshes, we see it in coral reefs. So zonation is one of the classic ways that benthic organisms adapt to their environments. All right, so we've talked about adaptations in the plankton, we've talked about adaptations in the nekton, and we've talked about adaptations in benthic organisms. All right, I want to remind you to answer the questions in the accompanying quiz. And just remember, it's not really a quiz. It's just designed to make sure you've watched the lecture. You can go ahead and refer to the lecture when you're answering those questions. And I want to remind everyone to be healthy and be careful. Isolate yourself, please. Practice social distancing. We don't want you to get sick. We don't want your family to get sick. We don't want anyone in your community to get sick. So please be careful. And I hope you all are doing well. I know this is an unusual time. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you later.